There are a lot of people out there that say, and I know the answer to that, Jesus was a prophet. And I want you to tell my viewers what sense can you make of that, or what no sense can you make of that?
When they say Jesus is a prophet,
He wasn't the Son of God. He wasn't a deity. He was a prophet. I want to be clear. He was only a prophet. He wasn't the Son of God.
Well, obviously, when you're going to tell me Jesus is X, Y, or Z, you have to be appealing to some sources, right? So when I say to someone, okay, you say Jesus is a prophet, where do you get any information about Jesus? Well, the only sources they have are the Gospels.
Right.
So now you're stuck with it. So if you're asking me a question about Jesus, you're going to have to then tell me,
got to go to the source.
What sources are you appealing to know who this Jesus is? Besides the Gospels, there are no first century reports. Even like
but there are other faiths that say that Jesus was a prophet.
And I say, well, how do you know this? Like Muslims will say he's a prophet. Where'd you get it from? Oh, Muhammad said so. But Muhammad comes 600 years later in Arabia, far removed from first century Israel. I was going to say Palestine, but that's because in scholarly circles, they call it Palestinian Judaism. So I want to be careful. I don't want people to think, oh, just this is the term in scholarship. First century Palestinian Jewry. Israel, who spoke a different language. Jesus would have spoken Aramaic, Greek, because you'd have to interact with the Romans. And the Romans were not required to know Aramaic, but you're required to know Greek to communicate with them. And yet, you want to then tell me about this first century Jew, who he was, what he did, on the testimony of a man that came 600 years later in Arabia, speaking a language that neither Jesus nor his followers ever spoke. And you want me to stake my belief on who Jesus is, on the testimony of this man? That's not how you do historical research. A serious person will go to the earliest documents. That's why I was mentioning Bart Ehrman and these others. When they want to know about Jesus, they go to the oldest sources available, and they'll tell you it's the letters of Paul and Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, they'll tell you not everything in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is from Jesus. A lot of embellishments. Be that as it may.
Do you believe that?
No, of course not.
Okay.
Of course I don't.
Thank you.
If I believe that, then you and I got problems.
Well, when I say embellishment, do you believe, because we always say there's a little bit of contradictions in some of the Gospels.
Well, that's not because it's embellishment. That's because authors have the right to sum up statements, right? So in other words, if I examine Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, in light of how Greco-Roman biographies were written, see, what happens is you and I look at it from a 21st century perspective. They're first century sources. So I want to know how they wrote biography back then. How did they write history? And we have some outstanding Christian scholars who are conservative who've done immense work in this field. One I'll mention, maybe you can have him on. He's considered one of the leading historians on the resurrection and the gospel authorship. His name is Dr. Michael Licona. Phenomenal. One of the best. He's debated Ehrman and others on the history of the resurrection, on gospel authorship. He's done immense work showing that the Gospels are Greco-Roman biographies. And he quotes biographers of that time and historians how to write history and biography. And some of the rules included that you can sum up reports. You can rearrange the chronology, and this would be considered accurate reporting. So if I apply first century standards, Gospels pass with flying colors. The problem is we don't look at them from their historical perspective. We look at them from a 21st century perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So, but even in the 21st century, if you say something and I relay a report, I'm allowed to give the gist of what you said, and it wouldn't be considered that I'm being dishonest with your words.
Right.
So what you find in the gospel sometimes, like Matthew, if you compare it, and again, in fact, I challenge your audience to do this. Take Mark, take Matthew. Whenever you see Matthew and Mark report the same story, Mark gives more details. Matthew seems like he's in a rush and he sums it up.
Mm-hmm.
So whenever a story about Jesus appears in Mark that's found in Matthew, Mark gives you the longer version. Matthew shortens it.
Yeah. And the important item there is that they don't contradict one another. They're just telling it in a different way. But it's the same content, the same story. They're not a contradiction.
Yeah. Okay. So if you apply those standards, they pass with flying colors.
Okay.
In fact, go ahead.
So getting back to
Jesus is
people say Jesus is only a prophet.
Well, he's a prophet of God. He can't lie, right? So this prophet says he's the unique divine Son of God, that he's one with the Father, and claims things that no mere mortal could claim, which is why constantly in the Gospels, the Jews are accusing him of blasphemy. Why? Because they're looking at a first century Jew claiming things that no first century Jew would dare claim if he's a God-fearing monotheist. Because remember, the Jews, their worldview is the Old Testament. God is not a man, and he's definitely not a Jewish man, which is true. God by nature hasn't always been a man. We're not Mormons. Mormons think that God the Father is a man. The true God is spirit by nature. Unlike creation, and because he created time, space, this is what we believe. From the scriptures we believe, the material universe, space, place, created. That means he's the kind of being that doesn't need space or place. Well, if he doesn't need space or place, he doesn't have a body, because bodies require space and place. So God is spirit in the sense that he is bodiless, doesn't need space. But that God can become man without ceasing to be God. See, this is what we say. We don't say a man is God. We say that the eternal Son, the eternal Word, is capable of taking on human nature from the Holy Blessed Virgin, his mother, in the power of the Holy Spirit, becoming human, living a human life without ceasing to be God. Now, with that said, even the Jews could see what Jesus claimed, no Jew could claim. And that's not just in the Gospel of John, because they'll tell you, well, John is more embellished. It comes later, and it's more theological. It's found in the Gospel of Mark. If you go to Mark 15, 60 to 64. Why do they condemn him to die? For blasphemy. What was the blasphemy? The high priest says, I adjure you by God. Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? Now, to be the Christ, the Son of God, that wasn't blasphemous. As you know very well, so I'm preaching to the choir, but we're helping your audience. The term Christos, simply the Greek translation of Mashiach. Anointed one in the Old Testament refers to a variety of offices and individuals. The high priest is called Mashiach. Leviticus 4:3, he's called Mashiach, Christ. Cyrus, a pagan, Isaiah 45:1. Cyrus, God says, my Messiah, my anointed one, right? Shichi, the anointed one of Israel, the king, was the Son of God. So Jesus isn't the only royal Son of God. David was God's son. Solomon was God's son. If you were an anointed king, you became God's royal son, sitting on God's throne on earth. So to say you are the Christ, the Son of the Blessed, wasn't blasphemous. It's what he says afterwards. This is where they said, high priest, rent his clothes. He goes, you've heard the blasphemy. What more do we need of witnesses? What do you decide? He needs to die. Why? Because he said, I am. And you shall see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, coming with the clouds of heaven. Now, why did they think it's blasphemous? He was referencing Daniel 7:13. Daniel, you and I believe, traditional, conservative dating, Daniel wrote in the 6th century BC, 500 years before the birth of our Lord in Babylon. He's seeing a vision of two divine figures. And I want your audience to go open up Daniel 7, start reading from verses 9 all the way.
Pay attention.
Yep, so two figures, Daniel 7, 9 to 10. He sees thrones set in place, and he sees what he says, an ancient of days, very old, ancient, white hair, white robe, seated on a throne. Then later on, he sees in a vision, one like a son of man, coming to the ancient of days. And he's brought near him, and he's given a dominion power that's indestructible. And all nations, peoples, and languages must worship him. Jesus just claimed to be that second divine figure who reigns alongside the Ancient of Days, whom according to Jesus is the Father. You shall see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power. Who's the power? My Father, the Son of God, his Father. Coming with the clouds of heaven. That's what they took to be blasphemous. That you, a Jew, claim to be that divine human figure who's on the same footing with God the Father, whom all nations must worship forever? Blasphemy. So there is no gospel. I can go through Mark. I don't need John. And I can show you the Trinity from Mark. And I dare people to challenge me on this. And show you that Christ claimed to be more than a man, not the Father, distinct from the Father, but God in nature, just from Mark. So there is no gospel that gives you a merely human Jesus. Mark, Matthew, and the reason why I keep mentioning Mark, if your audience may not know, sometimes I'm assuming the audience will pick up. Why does he say Mark, not Matthew? Even though in your New Testament, we start with Matthew, according to New Testament scholars, and I put in quotation marks, just because a scholar says it doesn't mean it's true. They will tell you Mark was the gospel written first. That's why they say Mark is the oldest. They say Matthew, Luke used Mark. Why do they say that? Because there's material in Mark found in Matthew and Luke. So what do they surmise? Now this is all theoretical. They don't have any hard data. They don't have any manuscript evidence. They don't have any archaeological. This is theory. Now it may be true. I don't necessarily subscribe to it because the early church thought Matthew was first. So if you look at the early Christian writers, Matthew was first, then Mark, then Luke, and then John. Be that as it may, the order really is mute to the argument. I'm assuming their order to show you that even if I go with Mark, I still get a Jesus who's God in the flesh. Then if I go to Matthew, I still get a Jesus God in the flesh. Luke, Acts, I can do it all the Gospels. I just gave you one example. So there is no first century document. Even if I go to Paul, because remember I said historians think that Paul wrote the first book that eventually became part of the New Testament. They'll say 1 Thessalonians. You have others that say it's Galatians. When I go to Paul, Paul's Jesus is not merely human. He's the divine Son of God who appeared in the flesh, who reigns with God, will come to judge the living and the dead. You don't get a merely human Jesus from any of the first century sources. So if he is a prophet, prophets don't lie, and I have enough data that the historical Jesus made these claims, well, this prophet said he's more than a man. He's a unique divine Son of God in the flesh. So are now you going to believe it? Because if he lies, he's a false prophet.
He claimed to be God.
Yes.
And if he wasn't God, then he had to be somebody evil.
Exactly. And why
To
would this
claim
be
to be God and
Yeah.
not be God, something wrong.
It all hinges in resurrection again. Why would then God glorify a madman by raising him and making him immortal?